The text came in at 6:52 on a Friday morning. I was in the parking garage of a medical center in Columbus, sitting in my car with the engine still running, waiting for the defroster to clear the windshield before my 7:15 walkthrough. I was a hospital billing compliance specialist. My job, in the simplest terms, was to find the places where money moved incorrectly before anyone else noticed it was gone. I was good at it. I had been doing it since I was 26, which meant I had spent the last 7 years training myself to notice the small things, the rounding errors, the duplicate entries, the vendor codes that appeared once and never again. The text was from my ex-husband's brother. It said, "She moved everything out last night. Thought you should know. Sorry." I read it once. Then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat, watched the fog clear from the glass in slow diagonal streaks, and sat with my hands in my lap until my breathing evened out. Not because I was devastated, because I had been waiting for exactly this, and even when you expect something, the moment it actually arrives requires a second to land. My name is Sloane. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how my mother and my ex-husband conspired to take nearly $400,000 from me, and how I made sure they couldn't keep a single dollar of it. Let me go back. My ex-husband's name was Callum. We were married for 4 years. The marriage ended not with a dramatic blowout, but with the slow, quiet deterioration of two people who had grown into entirely different shapes and were no longer able to pretend otherwise. The divorce was civil, by which I mean we were polite to each other's faces and said nothing kind behind each other's backs, which is probably the best most people can manage. We had no children, we split the furniture, the house was mine. I had purchased it before we married, with money I'd saved from 6 years of working and living carefully, and under the terms of our settlement, it stayed mine. What I did not anticipate was my mother. Her name is Vera. She is 61 years old and has lived her entire adult life at a slight tilt toward whoever seemed most able to provide stability. My father provided it for 22 years before his second heart attack took him at 58. After that, she moved through a series of arrangements: a condo she couldn't afford, a brief period staying with my aunt in Phoenix, a year in a small apartment in Dayton that she described as temporary and that lasted 3 years. When the lease ended, she called me. I want to be honest about this part because it matters. I did not invite her out of obligation. I invited her because I miss my father and she was the person who had known him longest. And grief does things to your reasoning that you don't fully understand until later. I said she could stay in the guest room while she figured out her next step. I did not say it was permanent. I said 3 months, maybe 4. That was 2.5 years before the text from Callum's brother. What I also did not anticipate, or chose not to see clearly enough, which is not the same thing, was how quickly my mother and Callum would find each other again after the divorce. They had always gotten along. That had been one of the things I liked about Callum in the beginning, that he was easy with her, that he called her on her birthday, that he remembered she didn't like cilantro. After we separated, I assumed those small connections would fade naturally. They didn't. He would stop by the house on the pretext of picking up mail or returning something he'd borrowed. My mother would offer him coffee. I came home twice to find them at the kitchen table together, and both times the conversation stopped at a slightly wrong moment, a beat too fast in the way that conversations do when the person who just walked in was the subject. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself they were both lonely and I was being ungenerous. Then, about 10 months before that Friday morning in Columbus, I started noticing things. Callum had asked, during the divorce settlement, if I would consider leaving him as a secondary account holder on the investment account we had opened jointly early in the marriage. He said it was for administrative convenience while we unwound the shared assets. My attorney said it was unusual but not necessarily alarming, and since the account held only a moderate balance at the time, I agreed and noted it to close out his access within 60 days. I did not follow through on that in 60 days. I was managing a difficult audit cycle at work, and I let the 60 days become 3 months and then 5. That was a mistake. It was mine, and I owned it later. The first real signal came on a Tuesday evening in October. I had come home from a 2-day trip to Cincinnati to find a small stack of financial mail on the kitchen counter. Statements, an insurance renewal, a notice from my brokerage, opened. Not torn. Opened carefully, the flap lifted and pressed back down with that particular deliberate neatness that is the opposite of careless. I stood at the counter and looked at that stack for a long time. I told myself my mother had opened them by accident, that she was 61 and male was male. I did not tell myself that the second time was 3 weeks later. I came downstairs at 11 on a Sunday night for a glass of water and found my mother standing in the kitchen with her phone in her hand, and on the screen, clearly visible before she tilted it away, was a photograph of a document. The angle was wrong for me to read it, but the paper was cream-colored, the same cream as the statements from my primary savings account. She said she was reading a recipe. The phone was angled down at the counter. There was nothing on the counter. I said goodnight and went back upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I thought about Callum's question during the settlement about the investment account. I thought about the way he still came by the house, the conversations that stopped too fast. I thought about my mother's face in the kitchen, not embarrassed, not startled, recalibrating, and I felt something shift underneath me. Some foundational thing I had been keeping level through effort alone finally going still in the way things go, still right before they give. I did not panic. I have never been someone who panics. In my line of work, panic is expensive. The next morning, I called my attorney. Her name is Judith, and she is 54 years old and has been doing financial litigation in Ohio for 26 years, and the first thing she said when I finished was, "How much do they have access to?" I said, "Probably more than I realized." She said, "Then we moved today." What followed was 4 months of very quiet, very careful work. Judith referred me to a forensic accountant named Warren, who spent 11 days reviewing my full financial picture. He found what I had suspected but hadn't wanted to see clearly. Over the previous 7 months, someone had accessed my brokerage portal through a remembered login on the household tablet that I kept on the kitchen counter and that my mother used regularly for recipes, crosswords. The access logs showed browsing through account summaries, document downloads, balance histories. Nothing had been moved yet, but someone had been learning the layout of everything I owned. The restructuring took 6 weeks. My primary savings, $380,000 accumulated over 9 years of working carefully and spending carefully and reinvesting carefully, was moved to a new account at a different institution under a different login that existed on no device in my house. What remained in the original account was a structured balance, real money, but arranged in a way that any unauthorized transfer would trigger an automatic hold and generate a documented paper trail across state lines. Judith had a contact at the bank's fraud unit, a senior investigator named Phil, and she briefed him directly on what we suspected and why. I updated the tablet's screen lock and changed the household Wi-Fi password. I did it gradually, over 2 weeks, so it looked like routine maintenance. I removed my mother from the household expenses card I had given her for groceries and gas, told her the card company was reissuing, and replaced it with a new card with a $300 ceiling and real-time transaction alerts to my phone. I had a security system installed, motion-activated, full audio and video, cloud-backed to a server they had no knowledge of and no access to. Judith had told me to treat my house as a potential evidence scene before anything happened. I treated it as a potential evidence scene. I also had a conversation with my neighbor across the street, a retired school teacher named Bev, who had known me for 4 years and who watched the neighborhood with the particular attentiveness of someone with no immediate family nearby and a good view from her front porch. I told her I'd had some concerns about security and asked if she'd be willing to text me if she saw anything unusual around my property. She said she would. She meant it. Then I waited. The Columbus trip was scheduled for a Thursday-Friday. I told my mother on the previous Sunday casually that I'd be gone overnight for work. I said I was driving down Thursday morning and would be back Friday afternoon. I watched Callum's car slow in front of the house twice that week without stopping. I watched my mother send 3 texts in quick succession on Wednesday night to a number I didn't recognize. I noted the time. I went to bed. I drove to Columbus early Thursday morning. I checked into the hotel, reviewed my audit materials, and sat down for the kind of focused work that requires the absence of everything else. I was on the 4th floor of the hospital's administrative building reviewing a discrepancy in a vendor payment cycle when my phone buzzed with the alert from the household security system. Motion detected. Front exterior. 8:14:14 a.m. I opened the clip. A moving truck, white, no logo, had pulled into my driveway. Callum was standing at the back of it. My mother was in the doorway. I put my phone down on the conference table and breathed for 30 seconds. My hands were steady. I was aware of a tightness behind my sternum that I decided to address later, when there was time for it. I forwarded the alert to Judith. I texted Phil at the bank. Then I called Bev. She answered on the second ring. I could already hear from her voice that she was at the window. "There's a truck," she said. "A man I don't know, and your mother. They've been loading things for about 20 minutes. I was just about to call you." I asked her to film what she could from her porch without approaching. She said she would. She filmed 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Callum was visible in the footage for most of it. His car, a gray Jeep I had watched slow in front of my house 3 times that week, was parked at the curb. I watched my audit materials for the next 4 hours and did the work I was there to do, because I was not going to let them take that from me either. Then I drove home. I want to describe the house as I found it at 6:47 that evening because the specifics are the part that stays with you. The entryway was bare. The console table where I kept my keys and a small lamp my father had given me the year I bought the house was gone. The lamp was a second-hand brass thing, not worth much, and its absence bothered me more than the missing television did, which I didn't fully understand until later. The living room had 2 parallel dust rectangles on the floor where the couch and the armchair had been. The bookshelves were empty, not missing, just empty. The books stacked in piles they apparently hadn't gotten to. Which was the one place Callum had always been predictable. He had no use for books and wouldn't have thought to take them. My grandmother's ring, which I kept in a small dish on my dresser, was gone. It was not worth money in any way that would matter in a court filing. It was worth something else entirely. I put on the latex gloves Judith had told me to have ready. I photographed every room, every bare bracket, every empty shelf, every open drawer. I documented the safe in the hallway closet which they had opened. I had given my mother the combination years ago for emergencies, and taken the $600 in cash I kept there along with several documents I had placed deliberately to look like account information. What they had not found was the sealed envelope taped to the inside of the safe's back panel, behind the mounting bracket containing a notarized statement from Judith, dated 10 days prior, documenting the restructuring of my accounts and the evidence gathered to that point. I photographed it in place. Then I removed it and put it in my bag. Then I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink and let myself feel, for exactly 1 minute, everything I had been holding still for 4 months. My mother called at 7:22. I let it go to voicemail. Callum called at 7:45. I let it go. My mother called again at 8:33 and at 8:77 and at 8:31. On the 4th call, I answered. She did not say hello. My mother hasn't said hello to me in years. She opens conversations as though they're already in progress, as though the gap since the last one doesn't exist. She said, "The card isn't working and the account is locked and I need you to fix it right now." I said, "Which account?" She said, "You know which account." I said, "The accounts that belong to me." There was a pause. Then her voice changed register in the way it does when she's recalculating. She said Callum had told her the money was going to be split, that he had explained the whole thing, that they had an arrangement. I said, "An arrangement with whom?" She didn't answer that. Callum called again at 9:04 and I answered. He skipped pleasantries too. He said whatever I had done with the accounts I needed to undo it immediately, that he had rights under the settlement agreement, that his attorney was going to hear about this. I said the investment account he had been named on had been administratively closed 4 months ago per the terms of our original settlement, which was accurate, and that any action on the existing accounts would be addressed through proper channels. He said I was being vindictive. I said I was being precise. He said those weren't the same thing. I said he was right, they weren't. I wrote down that exchange word for word when I hung up. Judith appreciated it later. What followed is the part that doesn't look like the movies. Real legal proceedings are conference calls and document requests and exhibit lists organized by date. They are sitting in Judith's office at 8 in the morning, going over a 40-page filing with a cup of cold coffee and a legal pad. They are a forensic accountant named Warren explaining to a detective the difference between authorized and unauthorized portal access in terms that will hold up in a deposition. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Sergeant Del Rey from the County Property Crimes Unit. She was methodical and unhurried, which made me trust her. She reviewed the security footage, Bev's video, my mother's texts to Callum in the days before the move, which Phil at the bank had been able to document as they related to the account access attempts, and Warren's full financial report. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "You documented this better than most investigators I work with." I said it was what I did for a living. She almost smiled. The transfer Callum had attempted from the flagged account processed into a federal review queue because the movement of funds across state lines Callum had wired to an account in Indiana triggered wire fraud statutes that Judith had flagged with the bank 6 weeks in advance. The funds were frozen within 48 hours. The paper trail attached to every digit made the account tracing straightforward. My mother's attorney negotiated a civil resolution 6 weeks later to avoid a full criminal proceeding. Structured repayment of the misappropriated funds, return of or replacement value for all removed property. A formal written acknowledgement in the case record that the removal had been unauthorized. Callum's situation was more complicated. His access to the investment account had technically not been revoked in writing. My mistake from the divorce process, which meant his attorney had some room to work with, and Judith was honest with me that going to full criminal trial would cost more in time than the remaining disputed amount was worth. His separate restitution agreement included a repayment schedule and a probationary structure that would escalate to felony charges if violated. Phil confirmed the frozen transfer was released back to my account in full. Between the recovery, the insurance claim for the removed property, and the restitution payments, I got back approximately 91% of what had been taken. Real life leaves margins. The furniture I replaced piece by piece on my own schedule. I bought a new lamp for the entryway first, a simple thing, ceramic base. Warm light. I bought the couch I had always wanted instead of the one I had settled for. I turned the guest room, my mother's room for 2.5 years, into a proper home office. Standing desk. A second monitor for the audit work I was starting to take on as contract projects in addition to my full-time position. A reading chair in the corner that nobody else would sit in. The room that had held someone else's long-term temporary situation was now the room where I was building what I actually wanted. I will not pretend that wasn't satisfying. It was the most satisfying thing. My grandmother's ring was not recovered. It was the one item I had not photographed specifically enough for the insurance valuation to apply. I know Callum has it or sold it, and I know there is nothing legally actionable about that now. I have spent some time being angry about it and some time trying not to be, and mostly I land somewhere in the middle, which is probably where I'll stay. My mother called once more, about 2 months after the resolution. She wanted to know if there was anything left to say. I thought about that question for a while before I answered. I thought about 2.5 years of groceries and utilities and driving her to doctor's appointments and handling her paperwork and keeping the household running while also doing my job well enough to afford the household in the first place. I thought about standing at that kitchen counter looking at the open mail and telling myself it was nothing. I thought about her face when I caught her with the phone, the way it went careful instead of ashamed. I said, "I don't know. Not right now." She hung up first. Here is the only thing I want to say directly. People who do what my mother and Callum did are not unusual. They are not exceptional in their cruelty or their cleverness. What they are is reliant on a specific assumption that the person they're taking from will be too tangled up in love or guilt or the fear of being called difficult to enforce anything. They count on the fact that you will absorb the loss rather than make it uncomfortable for everyone. They call it being family. They call it being reasonable. What they mean is, we are counting on you not to act. I acted. I want to be careful here because the framing of this as a trap, which is how Callum described it to his attorney, is inaccurate, and it matters that it's inaccurate. I did not manufacture a crime. I did not entice anyone. I noticed a pattern forming, documented it carefully, protected my assets through legal and transparent means, and ensured that when the action they were planning occurred, There would be a complete record of it. That is not a trap. That is what it looks like when someone who usually absorbs the cost of trusting people decides, one time, not to absorb it. The cost of that decision was losing what remained of a relationship with my mother, a marriage I had already left, and a lamp that couldn't be replaced. What I kept was everything I had built, every dollar, every contract. Every morning I wake up in a house that belongs to me, entirely, and that runs exactly the way I want it to run. That's not nothing, it's not nothing at all. So if you are reading this and you recognize something in it, the opened mail, the questions that are slightly too specific, the presence in doorways, the small rationalizations you make because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with, I want you to hear this clearly. Noticing is not paranoia. Documenting is not betrayal. Protecting yourself from people who have decided your resources are available to them is not cruelty. It is accounting, and sometimes accounting is the most loving thing you can do for yourself. I've thought a lot about what made any of this possible, not the legal steps. Those were Judith's expertise and Warren's precision and Phil's cooperation. I mean, what made it possible for me to act at all, instead of doing what I had done for years, which was absorb. The honest answer is that I had to stop confusing loyalty with passivity. Those are not the same thing, and for a long time I treated them as though they were. I thought staying quiet when I noticed the open mail was being kind. I thought not confronting my mother when she stood with that phone in her hand was being considerate. What I was actually doing was making myself easier to take from. There is a cost to that kind of patience, and eventually you pay it, one way or another, either in what gets taken from you, or in what you have to spend to take it back. What I know now is that paying attention is not unkind. Documenting is not cold. There is a version of intelligence that has nothing to do with test scores or credentials and everything to do with being willing to see what is actually in front of you, even when seeing it means something you don't want to accept. Callum and my mother were counting on me not to use that intelligence. Or more specifically, they were counting on the fact that I would choose comfort over clarity, that I would rationalize the opened mail, that I would believe the recipe excuse, that love, or the habit of love, or the fear of losing it, would keep me from acting on what I clearly saw. They were not wrong that those instincts existed in me. They were wrong that those instincts would win. There is something I want to say about resilience that isn't the version people usually mean when they use that word. People say resilience like it means bouncing back, returning to where you started. That is not what it felt like. What it felt like was standing in my stripped house with latex gloves on, photographing empty brackets on bare walls, and deciding that the absence of everything familiar was not the end of something but the beginning of a space I could actually build in. The furniture they took was furniture I had accumulated without much intention. What I replaced it with was chosen. The office I built in that guest room, my grandmother would not have understood the standing desk, but she would have recognized the feeling of claiming a room as entirely your own. Vera made her choices over a long time. Small ones first. The questions that were slightly too specific, the texts sent in the dark, the arrangement she made with Callum that she believed I would never untangle. Every small choice made the next one easier until the whole shape of what she had decided became clear in a single morning. That is how it usually works. Not one catastrophic decision, but a sequence of smaller ones, each one narrowing the path back. I made my choices too. To notice instead of ignore. To call Judith instead of wait, to document instead of hope. And those choices, made one at a time over 4 months, meant that when the morning came, I was ready for it. That is the only thing I would tell anyone who recognizes something in this story. You do not need to predict the future. You do not need to know exactly what is coming or when. You only need to be honest with yourself about what you are already seeing and then decide, one small choice at a time, whether you are going to act on it or absorb it. I spent a long time absorbing. I am done with that now.